Hey everybody, so I just want to spend a few minutes kind of going over the histogram in a little more detail than your course unit may have explained it. I think it's a really important part of any photographer's workflow, and even if you're not planning on being a photographer necessarily, if you're a graphic designer, a filmmaker, whatever your plans are, even just taking pictures on your family vacations, this is going to come in handy. So pay attention, and I'll do my best to make this quick and clear. So we're going to I have a few pictures here I just selected from my gallery. A lot of these are straight out of camera, so no fancy edits. I think I'm going to take this one. We're going to highlight this one here and pull it open. If you remember, the left side of your histogram represents your shadows, the right side of your histogram represents your highlights, and everything in the middle represents your midtones. Okay, and you can see in this picture on the screen, it looks fairly good. I mean, every screen is going to be different. The brightness setting on your monitor is going to be different. Every camera LCD looks different on the back. So, you know, judging an image by looking at a little JPEG rendering of your file information isn't necessarily the best way to judge if you have good exposure or not. And using your exposure meter in your camera, if you're spot metering, for instance, or you're like center weighted metering, and you know, instead of matrix metering where you take in the entire scene, as where your camera considers the entire scene, if you have a more specific meter reading, like in portraiture, if you're reading the light on the face, then your black background could be completely underexposed, even if the skin looks good. So it's really a good idea not to judge your exposure based on your camera meter only or the JPEG rendering only. The histogram is a really useful tool. So looking at this picture, it looks pretty good on my screen, and I'm looking up here in my histogram, and you'll notice that a lot of the tonal values are on the shadow side of the histogram. But part of that is because I'm shooting on a black background, and this man is wearing a black shirt, he's got black shoes on, and he's got dark hair. All right, so naturally my histogram is going to err on the darker side of the spectrum. And then up here, you know, this long line of mid-range, tonal range, and then kind of getting into the highlights here. This is his pants, it's his skin, it might even be this light over here on the left, which I haven't cropped out or cloned out yet. So, you know, if I were editing this, I would probably bring it into, let's see, well, quick note, I'm going to digress for a little minute. These little blue accent marks here, that's because up here on the histogram you have the show shadow clipping and show the highlight clippings. And so if I just hover over that, it shows me where my shadows and blacks have clipped the edge of the histogram. That's all that is. So if I were bringing this up for edit, I would probably bring my exposure up right about here. I'm looking at the highlights on his face primarily because I don't want to blow those out and lose the texture of his skin. But I'm getting pretty close here. One of my final steps in my workflow before going to print in Photoshop, I can bring up what's called a threshold layer, and I can see visually on the range from 0 to 255 where my black and white points are, and it tells me if I need to adjust them before making my print. That's a whole nother process. Don't worry about that right now. Go back to normal. So I would probably want a starting point about right here, right? And then if I hold my shift key and double click on the blacks and double click on the whites, then Lightroom automatically selects the white and the light and dark points for me. But if I do that, then when I come in on his face, I feel like I've lost texture. So I don't really want to go that far. I think I want to bring my whites down a little bit, maybe my exposure just a little bit. So this, ideally, I would have preferred to shoot the image like this straight out of camera. Okay, fortunately, I wasn't too off, and so it's not a huge deal. But if you go back to the original, you can see it's a little bit dark, but I still have good separation from the background, and, you know, not the end of the world. Just this is ideal. All right, so I'm going to go back to my grid here. This is another image I shot in that session, and it is way underexposed, right? I mean, the thumbnail doesn't even look good, right? So if I bring my exposure up and my highlights a little bit, and then we're gonna do my whites and blacks. You can also hold your Option key and use your sliders and kind of slide these up until you start to see the blacks just starting to come in. Okay, but again, I don't like the way that his face looks, so I am not going to trust Photoshop or Lightroom on this. I want to bring this in down here, maybe bring my highlights down. Okay, so my histogram's not so bad there. If I hover over the shadow clipping, there's some shadow clipping in his shoes and his pants, his armpit, so we could definitely bring the shadows up some. I took care of his arms. Anyway, you get the idea. Yeah, that looks pretty darn good. The only problem is now if I go in really closely, actually let's go like 4:1, okay? I'm going to look at his eyes and his skin texture. If I look at that versus this picture, right? This was the picture that was originally better exposed. The noise is less in this picture than it is in this picture. All right, there's just a better rendering of the data, the digital data. I'm going to show you a better example coming up a little bit later here, which is ultimately this is my end goal in creating this little tutorial, because really when you underexpose an image and you have to bring the exposure up or the highlights or the white points, you are asking Lightroom or Photoshop to fill in the dark details with information that you just don't have. And so what you end up with is a lot of grain. Okay, so let's just take a look at a couple more of these. How about this one? All right, so if we look at this image, let me make this big. So this is straight out of camera. It does not look very good. We have a lot of yellows, and you can see the seam in my V-flat. I'm using a blue gel on this side and a yellow gel on this side, so that's why it looks yellow and blue. That was an intentional choice. I was kind of creating this different look, if you will. But anyway, all of these darks here on the left are basically the black background, right? And everything here, this mid-range, is going to be every part that looks pretty good. So let's see, we've got like down here, and probably even some of the lighter ranges in the background might be represented here. All right, and then the highlights are right here and maybe right here. So you can kind of gauge when you look at your histogram. You can see like what might be what. You can try to guess what's what. I'm going to go back here and do it with another image here. How about this one? So here we have the pinks, the greens, the blues. Everything is pretty well laid out in this mid-tone to upper end of the histogram. I wanted it to be a little bit on the brighter side. I mean, I can always bring my exposure down. That's not the aesthetic I'm going for, but I could, and I won't lose detail. Of course, if you have highlights, you run the risk of losing information in your highlights, but I honestly think it's a lot easier to bring down the highlights than it is to fill in file information in the shadows. Plus, I wanted sort of this airy look, so that was my aesthetic. And then, of course, let's see if we have any clipping. We don't, but over here you can see very little, very closely. There's a little line right here of darks. That's probably going to be this area here in her shirt, right here in her shirt. Maybe there's some like up here under her chin. Certainly her eyelashes will render a little bit darker in the histogram. Maybe the roots of her hair. So, you know, that's just my best guess. I guess we can't really know for sure, but you can make an educated guess because you're very smart people. Let's take one more. Let's look at this one. All right. Actually, well, let's look at this one and this one. All right, this is grossly underexposed, and I shot this for an addiction graphic design class I was taking. I had to do an addiction poster, and it's my son. He's probably a lot of your ages. Anyway, you can see a lot of shadows, right? Let's go over to develop, and you can see a lot of shadow clipping. I did not mean to do that. I was not trying to shoot this so dark. This was a mistake on my part, an error on my part. The back of my camera looked better. I knew better, and I just failed. So I'm going to share my failures with you because it still happens to me. It will happen to you. Anyway, underexposed. If I start bringing up my shadows and my exposure, you know, I kind of like the darker look, but I don't know if I want it to be, let's see, let me bring this up a little bit. I like the darker look better, but if you start with something that's well exposed, you can always bring the blacks down, you can always bring the highlights up, but if you start underexposed, then you don't have much, as much of a bandwidth for editing. I'm sure all that makes sense. Okay, so last but not least, let's take a look at these two images here. Okay, I'm going to bring these into develop. And here we have an underexposed image. This is pretty typical. This is my first shot as I was trying to get my exposure in with this new backdrop. And this was eventually where I sort of went over, a little bit over, right before I found the right exposure. Does that make sense? So these were kind of my test shots, if you will. But I want to show you just the difference between, you know, matching the histograms and what the image quality looks like when you do that. Okay, so let's take, I'm going to hit C for compare. Okay, and select and can't, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take this picture on the right, and let's see, I want to hit C. I'm going to take this picture on the right. Ugh, I can't develop it. No. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to do that. Let me undo that. I'm just going to come over to develop and come here, and I'm going to bring my histogram up pretty high, like about that. The door was white, so it's okay for me to have this kind of high spike on the right hand side. Okay, And these blacks here are representative of her shirt and maybe the area behind her left ear. And then all of this stuff in between, this is just her face, her hair, maybe some of her blue jeans. So this looks pretty good to me, all right? And it's auto-syncing. I did not want it to do that. So we're just gonna come over here, reset that one. Okay, so now this is the one that was well exposed, and this is the one that was underexposed. Let's just try to make them look about the same. So I'm gonna bring my exposure down a little bit here. Okay, I'm looking at the histogram. These look pretty similar. Let me bring my highlights down here a little bit. Okay. Yeah, they look pretty similar, right? So now, I have to remember that this one on the left was the darker one. So I'm going to go to a 4:1 ratio here, or magnification rather, and I'm going to switch back and forth between that one and this one. Okay, let's see. No, come back. Here we go. There. Now maybe I can go to compare. All right, so we're going to go to compare. There. All right. It's a little bit hard to see. I'm not liking the way that this is rendering. Okay, that'll work. I think you get close enough. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that there is a lot more noise. It's a lot busier, it's more grainy than the image on the left, right? So these are both zoomed in 4:1. What if we zoom in even more? Let's see, develop. What if we go like 8:1, right? So we go from here, which was the dark one. This was the underexposed image that we raised the exposure on. And this was the image that was maybe a little bit overexposed, but had a much better set of file information, and we just brought down the highlights a little bit. You can see the difference in the grain and in the noise. And so that is why the histogram is so super important. When you are shooting and you're looking at your images and they're looking like this in camera, and you say to yourself, oh, I'm just going to raise the exposure in Photoshop or in Lightroom, I'll fix it later, no problem. Or if it doesn't even look underexposed in your camera, it looks good on the back of your camera, but your histogram is telling you it's not a well-exposed image, trust your histogram. Don't trust the JPEG on the back of your camera. All that JPEG is your camera's algorithmic information calculating what it thinks you're after as far as your image. And as photographers, as graphic designers, as artists, you are the only one that can make those decisions. Your camera should not be in charge of those. So don't go by the back of your camera. And always shoot in RAW. If you don't, definitely shoot in RAW, because you will have a lot more information to work with if you need to make some adjustments. And anyway, sorry that got a little bit long-winded, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Professor Sanders. And I don't know, I hope it was helpful, and I will see you next time.